What do you do about the fact that the one that's pumping in investment is unstable? You pump in another one to offset that. All right, this is what the post-Keynesians are going to argue. We have to have the government offsetting the instability from the investment, and in a very particular way, which you'll read about in the book. And okay, I'll come back to that later. All right. No. I should go ahead and do it now. Even though it comes later in the book, I think that probably it makes sense to address this now. All right. Now, how do you finance this government spending? All right, how do the post-Keynesians say, well, what if we run out of money? What if the government runs out of money? What do we do then? This is what they're talking about that right now, that we can't continue to support the private sector because the government might go bankrupt. What do the post-Keynesians say about that? I'm glad you asked that question. Now, taxes ain't going to do it. We can't get the money for this spending right here. This is the government offsetting the fluctuations in investment up here in order to keep us at 20 trillion. This is the government doing it. And in order to finance that, we can't finance it via taxing households because then they will lower consumption spending. We can't tax businesses. They'll lower investment. The only other choice is deficit spending. To spend more than the government takes in taxation, because only that is a net injection of income into the macroeconomy. Now, you've heard all these terrible stories, I know, about how, what's this? We don't spank them anymore. We just tell them how much they owe to the national debt. That is not true. Happy Independence Day, U.S. debt owned by China, okay, which is actually like 7%. All right. So I'm going to take 2 steps here to explain the post-Keynesian view on this. The first is about budget deficits and surpluses. And the question is, aren't budget surpluses good? Shouldn't we want budget? Remember the end of the Clinton administration? They look, from deficit to surplus for America's future. Yeah. Think of it this way. What if there's 2 people in the economy? Alfred Marshall and Adam Smith. And at the end of the year, Marshall has paid Smith $100 for various goods and services. And Smith has paid Marshall $150 for various goods and services. So Smith has a deficit of $50 and Marshall has a surplus of $50. Which person would you rather be? And when I ask this in birthday parties and shopping market openings, people say, I'd rather be Alfred Marshall. That's right. And that's who you are. Because if the government has a deficit, then by definition, the private sector has a surplus. Every deficit has to be offset by a surplus. You have a deficit with respect to somebody. If we added up every trade deficit on the planet, every trade balance on the planet, if we added all these surpluses as a positive number and deficits as a negative number, and students always get this exactly right, actually even people that aren't economists get this exactly right, if we added up every trade balance on the planet, what number do we get? We get 0. Because for every surplus, there must be a deficit. You have a surplus with respect to someone, you have a deficit with respect to someone. So if the government has a deficit, if the government spent more than they earned, then somebody must have earned more than they spent. And that's the private sector. That's exactly what that means. That is why, backing up one more, I believe, that is why the deficit spending is a net injection right here. All right, so going back to this again. All right. If the public sector spends more than it earns, then it must be true that the private sector earns more than it spends. When the government runs a budget surplus, it drains income from the private sector by taxing away more money than it injects. You should see, I don't think I put that in this one. No, you should see the numbers on private sector debt at the end of the Clinton administration when they ran those surpluses. It was horrific. Private sector debt skyrocketed. And of course it did, because the government taxed more money away from households than they injected through spending. It's really quite simple and logical if you think of it that way. So let's see. Don't worry about that one. And then here's this article that's been cited so many times now, and I believe it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it is basically arguing that those Clinton surpluses were terrible for the U.S. economy, that they drained people's incomes away. And again, all you got to do is look at the data, and you can see the private sector debt skyrocketed. And we already had a deficit with respect to the rest of the world, and now the private sector also had a deficit with respect to the government, because the government had a surplus. All right, I don't remember why I put, hey look, well you can't see that. I don't remember why I did George Takei here for this question. But okay, so let's say you're with me so far, or with the post-Keynesians I should say, that surpluses are a way of, good Lord dog. I'm going to have to go see to him. Hang on. Let's see, is my microphone on? Yes, it is. He was barking at our neighbor, who was a TCU graduate, and therefore does not deserve to be barked at. Weren't you, Coble? Huh? He's sat around all day while I've been doing all these videos, and I believe he has a lot of pent-up energy, as you can be able to hear him talking right now. All right, so let's say you're with me so far. I'm sorry, as I said a moment ago, with the post-Keynesians, on the idea that the economy doesn't fix itself. We don't automatically go to full employment, and that one of the core problems is the fluctuation in investment. But one of the ways to offset the fluctuation in investment is to have government spending offset it, because government deficit spending, is a net injection, and that in fact what the Clinton administration did was actually quite damaging. Let's say you're with me so far. Still, surely we can't do that forever, right? I mean, at some point, the U.S. may accumulate so much debt that we would have to default on it. So, yeah, sure, in the short run, we can sit here and pump up the economy with government spending, but we can't do that forever. So I asked George Takei, a famous actor from Star Trek, to speak on this for us. What are the chances that the U.S. would be forced to default on the debt? Oh my. That's one of his things here. Oh my. That's as likely as a Klingon with a pet tribble. Okay, you have to have seen the original Star Trek series to get that. Klingons hate tribbles. Tribbles are these little furry animal things, and Klingons are mean, so they don't like them. So it's impossible for the United States of America to default on debt that is in dollars. Now this is small print here, so let me turn around here and read it out to you, because this is something that people never believe. Here's a quote from Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chair. The United States can pay any debt it has, because we can always print more money to do that. So there is zero probability of default. Here is some guy that's a fund manager. In the case of governments boasting monetary sovereignty and debt denominated in its own currency, in other words, we make our own money and our debt is in our own money. Like the United States, it is technically impossible to fall into debt default. Here's Mike Norman, also a financial analyst. There's never a risk of default for a sovereign nation that issues its own free-floating currency. Here's the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in an article they wrote. As the sole manufacturer of dollars, whose debt is denominated in dollars, the U.S. government can never become insolvent. Here's another joker here. So it goes on and on. Here's Dick Cheney. Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. Here's Alan Greenspan again. Central banks can issue currency and non-interest-bearing claim on the government effectively without limit. Beardsley Rummel. The necessity for a government to tax in order to maintain both its independence and its solvency is true for state and local governments, but it is not true for a national government. This is the guy that was in charge of the finances during World War II. And then there's Reagan saying it, and so on. The problems we've had with debt default in other countries was when their debt was in somebody else's money. If Mexico owes money in dollars, they're screwed because they don't make dollars. When Greece had their financial crisis, what was their debt denominated in? Euros, a currency over which they have no control whatsoever. So there may be other consequences from the debt and the deficit, but one of them is never going to be default. That is off the table. So don't even, this is what the post-Keynesians, don't even bring that up. That's not true. It might be inflationary. That's possible under certain circumstances. If the economy is already at full employment and we're spending with big deficits, it absolutely could be inflationary. Indeed, it was during World War II. During World War II, we've got huge deficits and unemployment around 1.9%. So yeah, that's why we had wage and price controls. If you continue to spend in deficit when we're already at full employment, then it's going to be inflationary. But when we're in a situation with high unemployment, then the deficit spending actually is unlikely to have any impact on inflation whatsoever, and I'm going to show you that in the next slides, in the next PowerPoint. All right, so let's see here. I don't need to show you all that. I will tell you that ultimately what post-Keynesians want to do, let me go back to this back here again. The manner in which, and this is at the end of the chapter, the manner in which they want to regulate this flow right here, the government flow, is by a jobs program. When people can't find a job somewhere else, the government stands ready to hire them. That way, we don't have to do like what we did with the stimulus after the financial crisis. We haven't got to sit down and go through various legislative arguments in Congress to decide how much we're going to spend. And there's a lot to tell you about that if you take intermediate macro with me about how they screwed that up. But this is automatic. Remember, our goal is to reduce unemployment. So if someone's unemployed, we spend enough to employ them. And then when the private sector expands, because this is getting bigger, we can squeeze this one off right here automatically because people can find jobs in the private sector. So this flow is going to be automatically regulated by how much unemployment there is in the private sector. Is that perfect? Absolutely not. But they're saying it's a heck of a lot better than what we're doing right now. And I think that's all I wanted to tell you out of this. I'm glad I remembered to do this one. We don't need to do that. That's for intermediate macro. That's from The Onion, actually some years ago. And that's it. I will say this, that there's this feeling that when the U.S. spends in deficit, they have to borrow from somebody. You saw that guy that was cooking out and had debt to China tied onto his ankle. After the coronavirus stuff started, we spent $3 trillion in deficit to try to get the economy at least sort of patched over while we shut down commerce. We didn't borrow that from China. China was in worse shape than we were. We didn't borrow that from Europe because the Europeans were having worse cases of COVID than we were. We just created it ourselves, which is what we always do. We create the money ourselves. We don't borrow from somebody. But that's really for intermediate macro. I don't want to go into too much detail on that.